Jinnah of Pakistan by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 11 London to Lucknow, 1934 to 1937. Part 2. Jinnah took all the trouble that was possible in doing my utmost to see that the central board is made as truly representative of the Mussalmans of India as possible. He reported after his board's first meeting. He consulted in Delhi with members of the Council of the All India Muslim League and various representatives of different provinces who were invited for that purpose and spent 4 days in the Punjab recruiting various leaders there. In addition to Iqbal, that first list included 3 future premiers of Pakistan: Liaquat Ali Khan of the United Provinces, H.S. Sohrawardy, 1893 to 1962 of Bengal, and Ismail I. Chundrigar, 1897 to 1960 of Bombay. Thanks to Jinnah's unique status and singular ability to attract and retain the loyal support of young men of such talent, intelligence, and integrity, the scattered crowd of Muslims were soon welded into a nation. Jinnah's lieutenants included men of wealth and business experience as well as wisdom. Before 1936, the League had always been in financial trouble. Most members never bothered to pay their annual subscriptions, even though value payable parcels were posted at considerable expense. In a majority of cases, Secretary Massan recalled. They were returned unpaid. The Maharaja of Mahmudabad came to the League's rescue when it was still relatively small by providing 3,000 rupees annually to support its activities after 1911. But other patrons had to be recruited to share the burden of running a full-time national party. One of those financiers who later remained among Jinnah's closest personal friends in the party was Mirza Abdul Hassan Isfahani, the scion of wealthy Calcutta commercial and financial empire, M.M. Isfahani Limited. Isfahani first met Jinnah during his fresher term at Cambridge in 1920. It was in the Michaelmas term, Isfahani recalled, that Jinnah accepted the invitation of Indian Majlis to address its members. He wore with distinction a thin streak of grey hair right in the middle of his head. At the time, I could well appreciate why women of diverse ages fell captive to his charm and personality. They met again in London several weeks later at Isfahani's uncle's house on Putney Hill. Ruthie's youngest brother, Jamshed Petit, was Isfahani's Cambridge classmate and friend. Jinnah and his bride were invited to a grand dinner there, where a jazz band performed, and most of the guests cut capers except for Jinnah and the young Isfahani, who went off to play billiards while Ruthie and her brother did the Charleston. Despite such early intimacy, Jinnah and Isfahani rarely saw one another again till 1936, when Isfahani was astonished to be invited by Jinnah to join the League's new Central Parliamentary Board. After becoming a barrister of the Inner Temple, Isfahani had gone into family's business, and though elected to the Calcutta Corporation in 1933, he took little time from business for either provincial or national politics. He did not, however, hesitate to accept Jinnah's call and emerged as the League's major backer in Bengal. Jinnah's League was faced in 1936 with 2 parties competing for Bengali Muslim allegiance: the Nawab of Dhaka's United Muslim Party and Fazlul Haq's Chak Proja Samiti, Peasants and Tenants Party. The Nawab scheduled a 3-day convention of his party in Calcutta's town hall, but Isfahani and his friends engineered a dispute there in early August by getting Fazlul Haq and his followers to attend the conference and to demand to be heard, which led to the conference's dissolution. It was agreed between the United Muslim Party's leaders and Fazlul Haq's group to invite you to settle same. Isfahani wired Jinnah adding, "Wonderful opportunity created. Please leave for Calcutta immediately. advised date departure. Jinnah reached Calcutta a week later and addressed a meeting of the Bengali Muslim leaders in the town hall. The United Muslim Party agreed to merge with the League. The merger brought such vital leaders into Jinnah's ranks as H.S. Sohrawardy and Khwaja Nazimuddin, who would serve Pakistan both as the Governor General and Prime Minister respectively. Initially, Fazlul Haq also agreed, and Jinnah named him to the Central Parliamentary Board, but by September 1st, he had changed his mind. Always more radical than Jinnah and equally ambitious, Fazlul Haq proved his most mercurial ally, never long remaining in harness with anyone. The ostensible causes of his change of heart in 1936 were his party's twin demands that Bengal's zamindari landlord class be abolished without compensation and that free and compulsory primary education be introduced throughout the province without raising additional taxes. Jinnah favored both measures but insisted on appropriate legal payment for each. Fazl Haq's Krishak Pruja Smati ran its own slate of candidates for Bengal's Muslim seats and managed to capture almost as many as Jinnah's League did, 38 to his 40. It was not mild just before the new provincial assembly met that Jinnah could negotiate an agreement with Haq, merging their parties and luring enough Muslim independents to join then in order to give the new Bengal ministry, which Fazl Haq himself headed, a comfortable majority. And Jinnah made one other important addition to the League. Next to Liaquat Ali Khan, who served Jinnah most effectively as honorary secretary of the League, the young Raja of Mahmudabad, 1914 to 1973, Amir Ahmad Khan, was Jinnah's foremost supporter in the United Provinces. As the largest Muslim landlord of Lucknow, the Raja enjoyed an estimated income of some 2 million rupees annually. Jinnah appointed him treasurer of the League's Central Board. The platform adopted by Jinnah's Central Board, on which Muslim League candidates stood for election in February of 1937, was much the same as that of Congress, including these advanced nationalist demands: to make every effort to secure the repeal of all repressive laws, to resist all measures which are detrimental to the interests of India, which encroach upon the fundamental liberties of the people and lead to economic exploitation of the country, to reduce heavy cost of administrative machinery, central and provincial, and allocate substantial funds for nation-building departments, to nationalize Indian Army and reduce the military expenditure, to encourage development of industries, including cottage industries, to regulate currency exchange and prices in the interest of economic development of the country, to stand for the social, educational and economic uplift of the rural population, to sponsor measures for the relief of agricultural indebtedness, to make elementary education free and compulsory, to take steps to reduce the heavy burden of taxation. Each of these had long been integral to the Congress' national demand, and all were anathemas to more conservative Muslim parties such as the Agriculturalist Party of the United Provinces Landlords, formed at Governor Sir Malcolm Haley's instigation. The one clear divergence between the League's socio-economic position and that of Congress, however, which reflected a basic difference in philosophy dividing Jinnah from Nehru and Subhas Bose, was the League's firm opposition to any movement that aims at expropriation of private property. Even as Jawaharlal placed increasing faith in socialist resolutions for India's problems of poverty, Jinnah retreated more than ever behind the bastions of private property. His growing passion for real estate and his constant preoccupation with details concerning the daily management of his ever proliferating portfolio of properties were, in fact, soon to rival his interest in politics. Private property, most of it forever rooted on Indian soil, became ironically enough almost as fascinating a diversion for Jinnah's mind and energies during the last lonely decade of his life as Pakistan itself. By this time, Rahmat Ali, the founder of Pakistan National Movement, was residing at 10 Montague Road in Cambridge, from which a massive quantity of strange religion political pamphlet letters appealing mostly to British lords poured forth between 1935 and his death in 1951. For example, may I venture to address this appeal to your lordship on behalf of the people of Pakistan at this critical hour? He wrote on July 1935, urging my lord's sympathy and support in our fateful struggle against the ruthless coercion of Pakistan into the proposed Indian Federation. The Government of India Bill, based on the Indian Federal Scheme, has created an acute crisis in the national life of Pakistan and has raised a supreme issue, an issue of life or death for its national future. He continued, I earnestly hope that you kindly will lend your fullest support to the inexorable demand of Pakistan, a demand based on justice and equity, for the recognition of its sacred right to a separate national existence as distinct from Hindustan. Pakistan is not Hindu soil, nor are its people Hindustani citizens. The very basis and content of our national life is founded on fundamentals essentially different from those on which Hinduism lives and prospers. We, the Pakistanis, have more than once emphatically repudiated the most shameful surrender of our national future made by the state-nominated Muslim delegates to the Round Table conferences in agreeing to the Indian federal scheme. They were neither the delegates of Pakistan nor the representatives of the Pakistani people. These distinguished exponents of the art of surrender, in complete disregard of the warnings of history, sold our nationality and sacrificed our posterity. They will have to answer for this, the most contemptible betrayal of Pakistan before history. Jinnah continued assiduously to ignore Rahmat Ali and his angry attacks, which were to become even more personal and virulent by the eve of Pakistan's birth. He would not, however, be able much longer to ignore the political demand of Rahmat Ali's obviously well-funded movement, sponsored from the heart of Cambridge. The platform adopted by the League's Central Board in 1930 included, indeed, a number of important concessions to Islamic fundamentalist groups within India, if not as yet to the extremist advocates of a Pakistan national movement. 3 out of the 14 planks were drafted exclusively to appeal to special concerns of the Muslim minority, whom 482 separate electorate seats alone were among those contested by League candidates. The League's first plank was to protect the religious rights of the Muslims. In all matters of purely religious character, due weight shall be given to the opinions of Jamiyat-e-Ulama Hind, Indian Ulema Party, and the Mujtahids. 2 later planks were to protect and promote Urdu language and script, and to devise measures for the amelioration of the general conditions of Muslims. The Indian Ulema Party, born during the Khilafat movement and then relatively dormant under the leadership of Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani and Maulana Ahmad Saeed, had merged with the Muslim Conference Party in the United Provinces to contest elections as the Muslim Unity Board, presided over by the Raja of Salampur, with brilliant Chaudhry Khaliquzzaman as its secretary. In February of 1937, Khaliquzzaman and several members of his board met with Jinnah in Delhi and were promised a majority on the League's United Provinces Parliamentary Board if they joined forces. It was one of Jinnah's most creative political coups, surrendering numerical for nominal power. The one thing he demanded was that Unity Board candidates all run as Muslim Leaguers, thus enhancing his party's stature while broadening the base of its support. He knew that to build a national party capable of asserting effective demands both to Congress and the British Raj, he might have to surrender provincial powers to any number of local magnates. He never balked at such demands, readily negotiating from weakness today and tomorrow, so that on the day after, his party would be in position to battle from a vantage point of strength. Liaquat Ali Khan was, however, furious at having lost control over choosing Muslim League candidates from his own province and tried his best to regain the power of selecting members for the UP's board, despite the fact that he was in a minority among the Lucknow 7 on the League's central board. Jinnah gave his verdict against Liaquat, who was so annoyed after their July meeting in Bombay that he resigned from both parliamentary boards and sailed off to England for a few months. Jinnah thus almost lost the support of the man who would become his right arm in transforming the League into a party second only to Congress and Pakistan's first Prime Minister. Yet he would rather risk so important a loss than go back on his word once it was given. Oxford-educated Liaquat later hailed him as the Disraeli of Indian politics, admiring his unpurchasability and recognizing the wisdom of his political judgment even when he most disliked its impact on his personal base of power. Liaquat looked to Jinnah the way a British public school boy looked to a headmaster, with emotional ambivalence and ultimate admiration. Jinnah's judgment paid off handsomely by the year's end. His league and its allies captured 29 of the 35 Muslim seats for which its candidate competed, while Congress returned not a single Muslim member on its own. Rafi Ahmad Kidwai was elected only because of Khaliquzzaman's help. It was an impressive show of strength, and had the League done nearly as well elsewhere, Jinnah might have wrested some real concessions from Congress's haughty leadership. In the Punjab, however, only 2 out of 7 League candidates were elected. In Assam, 9 out of 34. In Bengal, 39 out of 117. Most of the League's minority in Bombay and Madras were returned, and 109 Muslim League seats were captured for British India as a whole. By Jinnah's own estimate, his party returned from 60 to 79% of its total number of candidates. Congress alone won 716 out of the 1585 seats in all 11 provinces, however, enjoying absolute majorities in most of the country. But it elected only 26 members, an Achilles heel it hoped to remedy through working much harder in future Muslim mass contact. Nehru, stalking the campaign trail in 1937, made the mistake of refusing to take the Muslim League and the communal problem seriously, insisting, "There are only 2 forces in the country, the Congress and the government. To vote against the Congress candidate is to vote for the continuance of British domination. It is the Congress alone which is capable of fighting the government. The opponents of the Congress are bound with each other by a community of interests. Their demands have nothing to do with the masses." "I refuse to line up with the Congress," Jinnah insisted when he heard Nehru's simplistic analysis in Calcutta early in January. "There is a third party in this country, and that is the Muslims." A few days later, Jinnah publicly warned Nehru and the Congress to leave the Muslims alone. By sensing victory, Nehru refused to be intimidated and decided, instead of backing away from India's Muslim electorate, to seek to convert the vast mass of them to Congress's platform. Mr. Jinnah objects to the Congress interfering with Muslim affairs in Bengal and calls upon the Congress to let Muslims alone. Who are the Muslims? Apparently, only those who follow Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League. What does the Muslim League stand for? Nehru asked, with gratuitous insult and acerbity he would long live to regret. Does it stand for the independence of India, for anti-imperialism? I believe not. It represents a group of Muslims, no doubt highly estimable persons, for functioning in the higher regions of the upper middle classes and having no contacts with the Muslim masses and few even with the Muslim lower middle classes. May I suggest to Mr. Jinnah that I come into greater touch with the Muslim masses than most of the members of the Muslim League? It would not be the last of Nehru's political errors of judgment in his dealings with Jinnah, but it was one of the most fatal mistakes he ever made in a moment of hubris. More than Iqbal, it was Nehru who charted a new mass strategy for the League, prodding and challenging Jinnah to leave the drawing rooms of politics to reach down to the 100 million Muslims who spent most of the day laboring in rural fields. There was, of course, only one possible way for the League to stir that mass, to awaken it, and to lure it to march behind Muslim leadership. The cry of Islam in danger of deen, religion, alone could emerge as the unique stand of the Muslim League. No common principle or policy binds them. Nehru had taunted, referring to Jinnah's independent party in the assembly. And for Jinnah, this was as significant a turning point, traumatically triggered by public humiliation, as the Congress non-cooperation resolution rebuke he had sustained at Nagpur in 1920. Only then his was the secular rational leadership, seeking in vain to reduce a Mahatma to mere Mr. Now, Nehru had used Mr. before Jinnah's name as a sarcastic form of rebuke, for that title was the badge of British identity Jinnah appeared to epitomize, despite his claims to Muslim leaderships. It was a more scathing attack than Jayakar's had been at the All Parties Conference a decade earlier. Jawaharlal was more eloquent than Jayakar, after all, and had reason to feel more confident of his supreme power over the masses, more hopeful about Congress's future, and more bitter about the pains and punishment of the past, for neither his father nor his wife had lived to see his triumph. To hear the hoarse thunder of millions of voices cry, Jawaharlal ji ki jai, victory to honored Jawaharlal. He, moreover, was a man of many moods and the victim of strong passions, often swept from his mental moorings of sounder judgment by a surging impulse of the moment. It was Nehru's greatest weakness, fatal flaw in a man who aspired to political leadership over all of India and indeed believed that he was fit to rule the world. Jinnah, however, never lost his temper except for calculated political advantage. He used anger as a barrister or an actor would to sway his jury audience, never from an uncontrollable flaring of passion. For personal passion had all but died in him and was never to be rekindled. The hatred he felt towards Nehru was cold, born of contempt rather than rage. What can I say to the busybody president of the Congress? Jinnah remarked of Nehru in an interview several months later. He seems to carry the responsibility of the whole world on his shoulders and must poke his nose into everything except minding his own business. As Congress President, Nehru called a national convention in Delhi that March, following the elections, to decide whether, in fact, Congress would allow its successful candidates to take the provincial offices they had won. when the new constitution went into effect on April 1st, 1937. For Jawaharlal, this was another sore point of pride, since he had often declaimed against that charter of slavery and insisted he would never have anything to do with helping implement any part of it. Gandhi, however, urged giving the constitution a try, as most members of the Congress Working Committee wanted to do, and Nehru bowed to their advice. He refused absolutely, however, to invite any elected Muslim League or other non-Congress candidates to his conference, calling it a dangerous thing to revert to an all-party attitude and insisting that Congress should not cooperate with semi-imperialist groups. Khaliquzzama, who belonged to Congress for 2 decades before merging his unity board with the League in 1936, hoped that a Congress-League coalition government, including himself, might be appointed to administer the United Provinces. Muslim Rafi Kidwai, their leader of the Congress at this time, had been Motilal's secretary and remained Jawaharlal's confidant in Nehru's home province. Kidwai and Khaliquzzama were old friends, and it was hardly surprising, therefore, for them to discuss a coalition ministry with Kidwai promising Khaliquzzama 2 Muslim leaguers to join the Congress ministry prior to his election. Nehru turned down the League after his victory. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad was the only Muslim on the Congress Working Committee and managed to wean the Provincial Ulema Party away from its commitment to the League in mid-May of 1936. Azad used the classic lures of the Provincial Cabinet Office with all its seductive prerequisites to achieve that dramatic defection. He, of course, won Nehru's gratitude and trust and was to preside over Congress throughout World War II, serving in Nehru's first cabinet as the Minister of Education. But he won Jinnah's undying enmity. To Jinnah, Azad's political treachery placed him beneath contempt. "This is war to the knife," Jinnah remarked after learning of the Jamiatul Ulama's flip-flop. That July, Azad visited Lucknow and tried to negotiate a settlement with Khaliquzzama, offering to bring him into the United Provinces cabinet if the Muslim League group in the United Provinces legislature shall cease to function as a separate group, its members all becoming part of the Congress party. The League's provincial parliamentary board thus, in effect, agreeing to dissolve. Khaliquzzama rightly read those terms as a death warrant of the provincial party over which he presided and refused to agree. Meanwhile, Nehru called upon Congress committees throughout India to intensify recruitment among the Muslim masses. He had never liked the younger Nehru, but at this point lost all hope of flying to reach any agreement with him, appealing instead to Gandhi, who had withdrawn from active politics to his Wardha ashram retreat. That May, Jinnah sent a message to Gandhi through B.G. Khair, the leader of the Congress in Bombay's legislature and chief minister designate there, who had asked Jinnah to give him 2 members of his Muslim League to join the ministry. The League had done brilliantly in Bombay, capturing 20 out of 29 Muslim seats, and Khair had the good sense to know that with Jinnah's cooperation, his administration would be powerful and efficient one. Without it, a hopeless, thankless task. As to Jinnah's request that Gandhi personally enter negotiations to seek some sort of Hindu-Muslim agreement nationwide, the Mahatma replied, "I wish I could do something, but I am utterly helpless. My faith in unity is as bright as ever, only I see no daylight out of the impenetrable darkness, and in such distress I cry out to God for light." The forthcoming session of the League was to be held in Lucknow, and Jinnah knew that his presidential address must either galvanize his party to march towards a new destiny or would serve as its death knell. He must have sensed, moreover, that for him personally, as well as for the League, time was running out. He was always coughing, Isfahani recalled. Smoking and coughing. We thought it's just smoker's cough or bronchitis. None of us realized how bad it was until it was too late. He spent that summer in Simla and Srinagar, Kashmir. The legal demands on his time increased with his growing fame as Muslim India's premier advocate. Fatima joined him on his trip to Kashmir, accompanying him virtually everywhere from then until the end of his life as sister confidant, nursemaid, sounding board, and defender against the outside world. He pleaded before the Jammu and Kashmir High Court in 4 cases, 2 criminal matters, 2 civil, that summer. The most famous was the disputed marriage case of Hanifa Begum versus the state, where Jinnah won his client's appeal by forcefully asserting his personal knowledge. My lord, I am the authority, as an accurate interpreter of Islamic law. His prestige in the community was such that no one dared deny his claim, and as usual, he won every case he appealed. Wherever Jinnah went that summer and early fall, he invited Muslim leaders he met to come to Lucknow to attend the forthcoming League session. Beside Shafi's son-in-law, Mian Bashir Ahmad, other powerful non-League leaders, including the new premiers of the Punjab and Bengal, Unionist Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, 1892 to 1942, and Fazlul Haq also came to Lucknow at Jinnah's behest. And before leaving that fateful session of the League, they would agree to join forces in what was about to become a revitalized United Muslim movement, alarmed by Congress's victories and Nehru's attempts to cut the mass base of their constituencies out from under their very feet, if they failed to respond with alacrity and unity to that clear and present Hindu atheist challenge. Jinnah came by rail from Bombay, and as his train steamed into Kanpur Central Station, a vast crowd of Muslims mobbed his compartment. Jamiluddin Ahmad recalled, so exuberant was their enthusiasm and so fiery their determination to resist Hindu aggression that Mr. Jinnah, otherwise calm and imperturbable, was visibly moved. His face wore a look of grim determination, coupled with satisfaction that his people were aroused at last. He spoke a few soothing words to pacify their inflamed passions. Many Muslims, overcome by emotion, wept tears of joy to see their leader, who they felt sure would deliver them from bondage. He arrived that evening, October 13, 1937, in Lucknow, where 21 years before he had forged the pact that brought Congress and the League together for the first time, heralding a bright era of Hindu-Muslim unity that lasted little longer than the World War I. This time, storm clouds of conflict darkened the horizon, replacing that dawn, even as the pallor of age gave a sepulchral look to Jinnah's drawn and tired face. Khaliquzzaman and Mahmudabad had gathered a small army of League volunteers to await him at the station, and they led their president and his sister to a torchlight carriage procession through the winding streets of their former capital of Nawab Viziers of Oudh, where many a Mughal emperor had journeyed on bejeweled elephants. There was a scuffle at one place between the volunteers and some hot-headed congressmen, Khaliquzzaman reported, noting one of the opening salvos of what was soon to become the Congress-League civil war, India's political prelude to partition. The Punjab's Sir Sikandar met with Jinnah and the League Council the next morning, listing his demands for merging his powerful Unionist party forces with the League. He essentially insisted upon the retention of his party's totally autonomous control over the Punjab, where the League had elected only 2 out of the 86 Muslim members to the legislature. Jinnah had no option but to accept mighty landlord Sikandar's terms, gladly stooping to embrace and conquer that Punjabi baron. The pact concluded that October 14th between British India's 2 most powerful Muslims was approved with thunderous cheers by the Council of the Muslim League. And well should they have cheered for. Without Punjab, the League had no real heartland of power, no core around which to build its potential claim to nationhood. The Punjab was more than just a bare Muslim majority province. The Punjab meant Pakistan and made Pakistan possible. Bengal was too remote from the rest of Muslim India, and as was Hyderabad, Sindh, the northwest frontier, Balochistan, and Kashmir were islands of Muslim dominance, yet none was large enough, none strong enough to stand alone. The Punjab was the motor that integrated, unified, and bridged every one of those other northwest provincial units. The Punjab was Pakistan's first and foremost important capital letter, and by hiring Sir Sikandar into his party's tent, Jinnah raised the green flag with its giant P over the League's Kaisar Bagh royal garden outside Mahmudabad House, signaling the birth of an inchoate nation that was to remain in the womb of British India for precisely 1 decade. Fazlul Haq closed ranks as well that fateful day in 1937, adding a remote eastern wing to the nation of South Asian Muslims now in the making. By sundown, Jinnah knew that this second Lucknow pact he had negotiated would tear asunder the subcontinent, just as his first pact had almost led to an independent but united rule for all of India. Soon Jawaharlal and the Mahatma would know it as well. Soon the whole world would see what one seemingly frail Muslim, a minority among that minority, white-haired and weary, could accomplish once he had set his mind to it. He had been taunted, ignored, humiliated, and dismissed as insignificant long enough. Now he had the premiers of the Punjab and Bengal to stand between. The next day he would speak for them all. His was going to be the one mighty magnified final voice of Muslim South Asia. To symbolize the dramatic change marked by this Lucknow session, not only in the League's platform and political position, but in Jinnah's personal commitment and final goal, he changed his attire, shedding the Savile Row suit in which he had arrived for a black Punjabi Sherwani long coat, donned by the Quaid-e-Azam, great leader, for the first time in public on the morning of October 15, 1937. He had spent the night at Mahmudabad House and after breakfasting with the Raja was about to leave for the packed meeting outside when his eye was attracted to the black Persian lamb cap worn by Nawab Muhammad Ismail Khan, 1886 to 1958, one of the greatest provincial league leaders. He asked his friend if he might try on that compact cap, which would soon be known throughout the world as the Jinnah cap. When he saw how handsome it looked over the white of his sideburns in a mirror, he knew that it was just the headgear needed to give his Muslim costume its crowning touch. At the 1916 Lucknow session, over which he had presided, Jinnah had worn a red fez. But since Ataturk banished the fez from modern Turkey, it was out of style. The Jinnah cap resembled the fez but was softer yet equally Islamic in its symbolic significance. It soon became as famous as the flatter Gandhi cap of the hand-spun cotton, which the Mahatma and Jawaharlal wore. That cap came to symbolize Congress membership, just as the Jinnah cap helped immediately to distinguish and identify Muslim League leaders. This session of the All India Muslim League is one of the most critical that has ever taken place during its existence. Jinnah began addressing the estimated 5,000 Muslims from every province of India crowded into the huge tent erected in Mahmudabad's garden. The present leadership of Congress, especially during the last 10 years, has been responsible for alienating the Muslims of India more and more by pursuing a policy which is exclusively Hindu. And since they have formed governments in the 6 provinces where they are in majority, they have by their words, deeds and program shown more and more that the Muslims cannot expect any justice or fair play at their hands. Wherever they were in a majority and wherever it suited them, they refused to cooperate with the Muslim League parties and demanded unconditional surrender and the signing of their pledges. To the Muslims of India in every province, in every district, in every tehsil, in every town, I say your foremost duty is to formulate a constructive and ameliorative program to work for the people's welfare and to devise ways and means for the social, economic and political uplift of the Muslims. Organize yourselves, establish your solidarity and complete unity. Equip yourself as trained and disciplined soldiers. Create the feeling of esprit de corps and of comradeship amongst yourself. Work loyally, honestly, and for the cause of your people and your country. No individual or people can achieve anything without industry, suffering, and sacrifice. There are forces which may bully you, tyrannize over you and intimidate you, and you may even have to suffer. But it is by going through this crucible of the fire of persecution which may be leveled against you, the tyranny that may be exercised, the threats and intimidations that may unnerve you. It is by resisting, by overcoming, by facing these disadvantages, hardships, and sufferings, and maintaining your true convictions and loyalty that a nation will emerge worthy of its past glory and history and will make its future history greater and more glorious not only in India but in the annals of the world. 80 million of Muslims in India have nothing to fear. They have their destiny in their hands, and as a well-knit, solid, organized, united force can face any danger and withstand any opposition to its united front and wishes. There is a magic power in your own hands. Take your vital decisions. They may be grave and momentous and far-reaching in their consequences. Think 100 times before you take any decision, but once a decision is taken, stand by it as one man. As their great leader sat down, every Muslim in that pandal rose to cheer, sensing a new league had been born, that by some magic power Jinnah had taken his most grave and momentous decision and knew its consequences would be far-reaching, that there would be no turning back, not for him, not for his party. The Jinnah who had come to Lucknow, still in limbo, was torn between two worlds no longer. He left the old capital of Mughal power firmly rooted in his Muslim party's soil as its new Qaid-e-Azam.